The locket sat on the counter between them for a long moment before either of them spoke. Robert Anderson had placed it there herself, her fingers releasing it with the same careful steadiness she brought to everything, the same deliberate calm she had learned to wear the way other women wore good dresses. The gold had gone warm from her pocket. She kept her eyes on the stranger's hands rather than on the locket itself, because looking at it directly had become something she could no longer afford to do. The morning was cool enough that she could see her breath against the window glass, and the town of Harlan's Creek moved slowly past the pawnbroker's front door, a wagon, a woman with 2 children, a man in a canvas coat stepping off the far curb without looking. Robert watched all of it, and none of it. The stranger was studying the locket with the particular attention of someone who had handled many small and careful things. And she noticed his hands again, clean, steady. A slight roughness at the knuckle that might have been work or might have been weather. He looked up. "What were you asking?" $12, she said. He did not negotiate. He did not ask about the photograph inside, about the woman in the small oval frame whose expression was composed and slightly formal, in the way of photographs taken a long time ago. He set a $20 bill on the counter beside the locket without ceremony, folded his jacket over one arm and said, "Keep the receipt." Then he walked out, and Robert stood there with $20 in her hand and the particular silence of a transaction she had not known she was making until it was finished. She had 3 weeks of rent to cover. She had exactly enough now, and a little more, and she walked home in the thin October light, telling herself that was sufficient, that sufficiency was all she had ever asked for. It did not feel sufficient. The locket had been her mother's, and her mother had worn it every day of her life until she stopped wearing anything at all. And now it belonged to a quiet stranger who had not asked a single question about the woman in the photograph. Robert was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years, since Thomas had taken a fever in the August of the year the creek flooded and had not recovered. The house they had shared, a narrow white clapboard on Birch Street with a garden that was mostly Thomas's doing, was now hers alone and too expensive to heat properly, and the job at the Holt dress shop on Main Street paid enough to eat on and not quite enough to do everything else that needing doing. She had been very careful with money for 2 years. She had not expected to reach a point where careful became insufficient, and yet here she was, in October, walking home with $20 and the lightest chest she had felt in months, which was not the same as a light heart. Pearl Addison was sitting on her porch as Robert passed, wrapped in a wool shawl the colour of old mustard, drinking something from a crockery cup that steamed in the cold air. Pearl was 68 and had lived in the same house on Birch Street for 40 years, and claimed to have known everyone who had ever lived in Harlan's Creek, which Robert believed entirely. Pearl watched the world with the patient interest of someone who had decided long ago that observation was its own reward. "You look like you sold something," Pearl said. "I did," Robert said, and stopped at the gate. "Was it worth it?" Robert thought about that for a moment. "I had the rent at least." Pearl nodded slowly. She did not offer comfort in the way of platitudes, which was one of the things Robert valued about her. She simply said, "Come in for coffee when you can," and returned her eyes to the street, and Robert walked the rest of the way home. The Holt dress shop occupied the corner storefront on Main and Caldwell, a long, narrow room with good light from the east-facing windows in the morning, and a display case that Diane Holt arranged and rearranged with the attention a chess player gives a board before a match. Robert had worked there for 14 months. She did alterations primarily, and occasionally the simpler constructions from bolt fabric, and she worked in the back room with its particular smell of chalk and sizing and the faint, sweet note of the pressing iron. She was good at what she did. She knew she was good at it, not from vanity, but from the plain evidence of 30-odd garments a month that left the shop fitting better than they had arrived. Diane was 47 and had inherited the shop from her own mother, and ran it with the proprietary confidence of someone who believed that ownership of a thing was identical to understanding of it. She was not cruel in the theatrical sense. She did not shout. She issued corrections in a quiet voice that carried the absolute certainty of a woman who had never seriously doubted her own assessments, and she assessed Robert as a particular kind of useful. The kind of useful you did not invest in because investment implied a future, and she was not convinced Robert had one. She said things like, "You're lucky this town is small," when Robert asked about a raise, and "I suppose you do well enough for what we need," when a customer complimented the fit of a gown, and Robert absorbed these observations the way she absorbed most things, in silence, filing them away in the particular drawer she kept for facts about other people that she did not intend to act on. The stranger did not come into the shop that week, or the week after. November came in hard with frost on the windows by the 6th, and Robert took on a coat-lining job that Diane had turned away as too fiddly, and finished it in 3 evenings by lamplight, and gave the woman, a Mrs. Fuller from the road past the mill, a bill that was half what Diane would have charged. It was not a strategy. It was simply that Mrs. Fuller had mentioned in a quiet way while dropping off the coat that her husband was not working that month, and Robert understood what that sentence meant from the inside. It was on a Thursday in the 2nd week of November that the stranger appeared in the shop doorway. Robert was at the cutting table when she heard the bell above the door, and she looked up to find him standing on the threshold with his coat open and his hat in his hand, studying the shop with the same unhurried attention he had given the locket on the pawnbroker's counter. He was tall, leaner than she had registered in the pawnbroker's dim light. His coat was good quality but worn, the kind of wear that came from actual use rather than from theatre. Diane appeared from the display side of the counter and said, "Good morning. Are you looking for something in particular?" "I may be," he said, and looked past her toward Robert. "I came in last month about a piece for my mother. I wonder if someone here handles estate work." Diane said, "Our seamstress does alterations," in the tone she used when she wanted to convey that alterations and estate work were not the same category. "Robert," he said directly, not asking Diane. Robert set down her shears. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "I thought it was you." There was nothing particular in that sentence, no special weight that Robert could identify. And yet, she noticed it. She noticed the way his voice settled into a sentence without needing to announce itself. She noticed that he spoke to her and not through Diane, which was less common than it should have been. Diane's expression went briefly uncertain, the way a person looks when a social exchange has proceeded in a direction they did not direct, and then she smoothed it back into professional pleasantness and said she would leave them to discuss the project. The project was a suit jacket that had belonged to his grandfather, he said, brought along in a leather satchel, and he would like it taken in and the lining replaced if the material allowed. Robert opened the satchel and examined the jacket with the interest she brought to good old fabric, a fine dark wool, well cut in its original time, the lining silk but gone at the seams. "The wool will hold," she said. "The lining wants replacing. I can match it close, but not exact." "Close is fine," he said. 3 days if I'm ahead of the other work, 5 if I'm not." "I'm not in a hurry," he said. She looked up from the jacket. "Are you staying in town?" "For a while," he said. She wrote up the ticket, Merritt, he said when she asked for a name, C. Merritt, and she wrote it on the tag and hung the jacket on the alterations rack and did not think very much more about it, except that he had paid for the work in advance without being asked, and had thanked her before he left. not in the formal way of a customer acknowledging a service, but in the way of a person acknowledging another person. Pearl noticed the change in Robert's posture that evening, or perhaps it was the following evening, when Robert stopped in for the coffee Pearl had offered. Pearl noticed changes in posture, the way some people noticed changes in weather, as information with practical implications. "Someone came into the shop today," Robert said, wrapping both hands around the cup. Pearl said nothing, which was her way of saying she was listening. "A man I'd sold something to last month. He came in with a job for me." "From out of town?" "He said he was staying for a while." Robert turned the cup slowly in her hands. "He remembered my name." Pearl made a small sound that was not quite a response, and not quite silence either, a sound that meant she had registered something and would hold on to it. "He has good hands," Robert said, and then felt the oddness of saying it aloud and went back to her coffee. He came back for the jacket on the 5th day, having correctly predicted she would be behind on the other work. She had the jacket pressed and on a hanger, and when he tried it on and looked in the narrow mirror Diane kept for customer fittings, he turned once and said, "That's well done." "The wool helped," Robert said. "The wool didn't do it by itself." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he took the jacket off and folded it over his arm with the same unhurried care she had noticed before. He asked if she took other work, not from Diane's shop specifically, but commission work, and she said she did, occasionally, when she had time, and he said he might know of someone who needed something done. It was not a promise, and she did not treat it as one. She logged the payment, closed the ticket, and went back to the cutting table. Through the front window she could see him stepping onto the Main Street sidewalk, pausing to let a woman with a perambulator pass, and then continuing east in the direction of the hotel. Diane had been at the display counter during the fitting, pretending to arrange a row of hat forms, and after he left, she came to the backroom doorway and said, "He seems like a pleasant sort of drifter," in the voice she used when she wanted to convey that pleasant and drifter were mutually exclusive. Robert did not reply, and Diane went back to the hat forms. It was the following Tuesday, the 22nd of November, that Robert heard what she was not meant to hear. She had come in early before the shop opened to finish a hem that needed to be done before the customer arrived at 10. The back room had its own door onto the alley, which she used when she arrived before Diane, and she was already at the table with her needle when she heard voices in the front of the shop. The dividing wall between the back room and the shop floor had a ventilation grill near the ceiling, an old one with a wire screen, and sound moved through it freely, which was something Robert had known in an abstract way for 14 months and had never previously had reason to think about. Diane was on the telephone. That much was clear from the pauses and the way her voice had the slightly elevated register she used for suppliers. And after a moment, Robert understood she was speaking with a man named Croft, who she believed ran a cloth distribution business out of Canton. "No, I understand," Diane was saying. "And I've been patient with the delay, Harold. What I'm asking is whether the February shipment can be confirmed." A pause. "Yes, well..." Another pause. "The shop runs on very modest overhead, you know that. I can't carry excess staff into a slow quarter." A long pause in which Robert heard Diane move across the floor, the particular sound of her heels on the boards near the window. "The woman I have doing alterations, she's local, widow, and frankly, she works cheap because she doesn't have options. I keep her on because it costs less than not having someone, not because she's irreplaceable. If I need to cut back, she'd be the first to go. It's pity work, Harold. If I'm honest, she came to me when her husband died, and she had that look they get." Robert sat very still. The needle was in her hand, and the hem was half finished, and the ventilation grill admitted the grey morning light in a thin bar across the cutting table. And she sat still and heard Diane say, "Pity work," in the same voice she used when she was being precise about practical matters, Not when she was being unkind, but when she was simply being accurate, which was its own particular species of cruelty. "She's capable enough," Diane said as a kind of afterthought, and then the conversation moved to the February shipment and stayed there. Robert finished the hem. She did not finish it quickly or slowly. She finished it at the pace she always worked, because the pace was not about how she felt, and had never been about how she felt. She pressed it, hung it, wrote the time on the ticket, and was at the table with a cup of cold tea when Diane came to the back room at 9:05 and said good morning without looking at her directly, which told Robert that Diane knew she had been there when the call came in, or at least suspected it. "Good morning," Robert said. Diane busied herself with the supply shelf. Robert drank her cold tea. She walked to Pearl's that evening by the long way, past the mill, through the lane with the bare elms that had dropped all their leaves by the 1st of November, and stood now in the particular dignity of things that have given everything they had and were not ashamed of it. Pearl was inside by then, the lamp lit against the early dark, and she opened the door before Robert knocked, which she often did, as though she had a sense of approaching footsteps that went beyond the ordinary. "I heard something today," Robert said, sitting down in the straight-backed chair near the stove. Pearl sat across from her and waited. Robert told her, not with bitterness and not with self-pity, but in the plain voice of a person reporting a fact that had required some adjustment. Pity work. That was the phrase. She had worked for 14 months in the back room of the Holt dress shop and had been competent and quiet, and had done good work on a reliable schedule and had not asked for more than she was given, and the word that described her employment, to the person who provided it, was pity. Pearl was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, somewhere down Birch Street, a dog was barking at something it could not identify. "That woman," Pearl said finally, "has a very small idea of what things cost and what they're worth." She refilled Robert's cup. "What will you do?" "Keep working," Robert said. Pearl nodded once. That was sufficient. The week that followed was cold and close. Robert worked her hours at the shop, completed 3 alterations and began a 4th, and spoke to Diane as much as the work required and not more. She was not icy about it. She was simply efficient. And if Diane noticed a change in the temperature of their working arrangement, she did not remark on it. Caleb came into the shop on the Friday of that week, not with more work, simply to buy a length of ribbon, he said, for a package. And Robert was the one behind the counter when he came in because Diane was at the bank. He picked the ribbon himself, a dark green satin, and while she was wrapping it, he asked how she was getting on, and she said fine. And then, after a moment, said, "Busy season coming. Are you ready for it?" "I'm always ready," she said, and handed him the package. He looked at her for a moment in the way she had noticed before, attentive without being demanding, and said, "I believe that." She did not know why that was harder to absorb than Diane's assessment. It was a simple sentence. It should have been easy. She made change and handed it across the counter, and was grateful that the bell above the door covered whatever expression had crossed her face. The young woman arrived on a Wednesday morning, 9 days before Christmas. Her name was Agnes. She was 20 years old, and she had come from a farm 12 miles outside Harlan's Creek, with a wedding dress in a flour sack, and an expression that combined hope and apology in equal measure. The wedding was on the 23rd. The dress had been her mother's, and her mother had been a different size in 1921, and the dress as it stood would not close at the back by 3 inches at the waist, and nearly 4 at the shoulders. Diane examined it briefly, held the back seam, calculated something. "The alterations on this would come to $7, she said. "I can have it ready by the 20th. Agnes looked at the floor. "I don't think I can," she said, meaning the $7. Diane handed the dress back. "I'm sorry then. We're not a charity." Agnes folded the dress back into the flour sack with the careful movements of someone trying not to show how close she was to tears. And Robert, who had been pressing a collar at the back room table and had heard all of this through the open doorway, set down the iron. She came to the front room. "Leave it with me," she said to Agnes. "Come back Saturday morning." Agnes looked at her. "I can't pay until after the new year, Mrs. Anderson. My husband's wages don't start until January." "Saturday morning," Robert said. "The dress will be ready." Diane said, after Agnes had gone, in the quiet, steady voice she used for corrections, "You understand that was not your offer to make." "I'll do it on my own time," Robert said. "The shop isn't involved." "You're using the shop's tools and the shop's pressing iron." "I'll work it on my own hours," Robert said, "and I'll bring my own iron from home." There was nothing more to say after that, and nothing more was said. She took the dress home in the flour sack that evening. Pearl came to the door when she passed and saw what she was carrying and said, "Agnes Webb's dress?" Robert stopped. "You know her?" "I knew her mother," Pearl said. "Come inside. You'll need better light than that lamp you have." They worked together until 10 o'clock, Pearl holding pins and passing the thread, and telling Robert small things about the Webb family, the farm, the young man Agnes was marrying, a sensible boy from the next county who had steady hands and a clear head, and would probably do all right. The wool was old, but it held, and Robert let the back seams out along lines that the original construction had anticipated, because the woman who had made the dress in 1921 had been a careful maker who had left a little in reserve, as though she had known someone would need it later. Robert brought the iron from home on Thursday morning, a good cast iron she kept sharp, and pressed each seam as she went. She finished the fitting seams on Thursday, the detail work on Friday, and had the dress hanging in the flour sack again by Friday evening. She was back in the shop by 7 o'clock Saturday morning, which was an hour before Diane arrived, and Agnes came in at 9 looking as though she had not slept particularly well either, and Robert took the dress out and held it up. Agnes looked at it for a moment and then sat down on the fitting stool and put both hands over her face. "Try it on," Robert said. It fit. The waist was right and the shoulders were right, and the back closed cleanly along a seam that showed no evidence of having ever been anywhere else. Agnes stood in front of the narrow mirror and turned once, slowly. "I can't thank you enough," she said. "Go get married," Robert said. She was folding the tissue around the dress when she heard the bell above the door and turned to find Caleb standing just inside the threshold, his coat still on, looking at her across the room. He had the stillness about him that she had noticed before, an absence of fidget, a quality of taking in what was in front of him without needing to declare it. She did not know how long he had been standing there. She did not know whether he had seen Agnes in the mirror and seen the dress and understood what the transaction had been, or whether he had simply walked in on the last moment of something he had no context for. She folded the tissue and did not ask. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He looked at the flour sack. "Someone's wedding?" "The 23rd, she said. He nodded. He looked at her with the particular attention that she had been cataloguing for 3 weeks without naming and said, "You're always working, Robert." "Someone is usually needing something done," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small movement, a settling of the face that was not quite a smile but was clearly something, and she felt the warmth of it before she could stop herself, the way you feel the warmth of a stove before you're standing directly next to it. Diane arrived at 9:30 and saw him at the counter, and did not rearrange her expression fast enough to conceal the mild irritation of finding him there again, which Robert noticed, and which cost her nothing. The morning moved forward. A customer came in about a coat, another about Christmas alterations, and Caleb took the small chair near the window that no one ever used and read a newspaper and occasionally asked Robert something about the town, where to find decent coffee, whether the hardware store on Caldwell was the same one it had been 20 years ago. Small things, and she answered them while she worked. And it was the most ordinary morning she had spent in the shop in 14 months, which was not ordinary at all. At 11:10, the door opened and a man came in whom Robert did not recognize, heavyset, in a good coat, carrying a sample case that she recognized as the kind used by textile buyers. He had the look of someone who had come in for a specific purpose and was not interested in browsing. He looked around the room once and then his eyes stopped on Caleb. "Merritt," he said, and his voice had an almost startled quality, as though he had expected to find him somewhere else entirely. "Caleb Merritt. I heard you were somewhere in this county, but I didn't believe it. When did you come through?" Robert's needle stopped. Caleb set the newspaper down. He looked at the man without any visible urgency and said, "Floyd, I didn't know you were in this territory." "I'm calling on the dress shops in this region," Floyd said, still with that note of surprised recognition, "on behalf of the Merritt account. But if the man himself is here, I suppose I don't need to call on anyone." He laughed at this, a short, comfortable laugh, the laugh of a man sharing a reference he was confident about. "Your father's Canton buyers have been trying to reach you since August, you know. I imagine things have been complicated since Gerald passed." The room was very quiet. Diane had come to the doorway of the back room. Floyd glanced at her and then at Caleb and said, conversationally, "You know you're in Merritt territory here. The Bolton Mill 2 counties over has been running Merritt wool since your father signed that contract. And this shop, if I'm not mistaken." He gestured generally at the bolts of fabric on the shelf behind the counter. Diane's face went through several things in quick succession. Robert watched Caleb, not Diane. He had not moved from the chair, and he looked at her now directly, with the composed expression she had been reading wrong for 3 weeks, and she understood that the composure had never been a stranger's detachment. It was the composure of a person who had been in a room as himself and had been seen by exactly one person. Diane said, "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." Her voice had gone careful in a way Robert had never heard from her. The confidence that usually occupied every cubic inch of her delivery had contracted just slightly, the way a fire contracts when the draft changes. "Mr. Merritt, I had no idea you were familiar with the shop." "I've been familiar with it for a few weeks," he said. Floyd was looking between them with the pleasant obliviousness of a man who did not understand the room he had walked into, and did not much mind. "Well, I'll need to talk to you about the spring orders whenever you have a moment. The Bolton contract is up for renewal in February." He looked at Diane with the mild authority of a man whose leverage had just been clarified to everyone present. "And yours as well, Mrs. Holt. Your fabric account runs through the Merritt Mill. I imagine you'll want to stay on good terms." Diane said nothing for a moment. The hat forms on the display stand stood in their row at an angle that suddenly seemed like an arrangement made by someone who did not own the room. "Of course," Diane said. Pearl arrived at 12:30, which was not an accident. She had the instincts of a woman who had spent 68 years paying attention, and when she stepped through the door of the Holt dress shop with a small paper bag that contained a late delivery for a customer she had clearly been asked to bring in, she took in the room in one long, slow look and said nothing for a moment. She looked at Caleb. She looked at Robert. She looked at Diane, who was standing near the supply shelf, with the slightly rooted quality of someone who does not know which direction to move. "Pearl Addison," Caleb said, and Pearl raised her eyebrows. "You know me," she said. "Your reputation precedes you," he said. "My father bought cloth from your late husband's mill for 8 years, before the mill went to Hammond." "Gerald Merritt's boy," Pearl said, not as a question. She looked at Robert with an expression that contained several things: satisfaction and warmth, and a private acknowledgement that the world had occasionally organized itself along lines she approved of. "Well, this town is smaller than it looks." Robert was standing at the cutting table with both hands flat on the surface, and she felt the morning rearranging itself around her, in the way that happens when a known quantity turns out to have been a different quantity all along. $12, she had asked. 20 he had paid, and no questions asked. And she had thought it was because he was passing through and did not want the trouble of negotiation. She thought about the jacket, the grandfather's wool, he had said, brought in as a job, and she thought about the ribbon for a package, and the Friday morning, and the question about whether she was ready for the busy season, and all of it sat differently now. Every plain exchange reweighted by the name Floyd had carried through the door, without knowing what he was carrying. She thought about Agnes's dress. She thought about the flour sack on the hook behind the door, the 9 days of her own time, the iron she had brought from home. She thought about what Diane had said through the ventilation grill. "Pity work, Harold. She doesn't have options." She thought about $20 laid flat on a pawnbroker's counter without ceremony, without questions, without negotiating a woman in difficult circumstances down from 12. Caleb came to the cutting table, not toward the door, toward her, and he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and set something on the table in front of her. She looked down. The locket. It was her mother's locket, the same worn clasp she had pressed with her thumb 1,000 times, the same faint score mark on the back, where it had once caught on something. She picked it up and turned it over, and the clasp was still the same. And she opened it, and her mother was there in the left oval, composed and slightly formal, the way she had always been in photographs. The right oval, which had been empty for as long as Robert could remember, held a photograph she did not recognize. A woman, older, with a quality in her expression that Robert found it difficult to look away from, not because she was beautiful, though she might have been, but because she looked like someone who had been known very well by whoever had taken the photograph. "My mother," Caleb said. "She died in July. I thought they might keep each other company." Robert stood very still. She did not look up for a moment. She looked at the two small photographs side by side in the gold oval frames. Two women she would not have been able to tell apart from a photograph if she had passed them on a street, and who had apparently been held in the same locket on the same day in the same town without anyone having arranged it. "You could have just returned it," she said. "I didn't want to just return it," he said. From the display side of the shop, she heard Diane clear her throat, and Floyd say something about the Canton account, and Pearl sit down in the chair by the window where Caleb had been sitting all morning, as though she had always sat there, as though the room had arranged itself to include her. Robert looked up. Caleb was watching her with the expression she had been reading wrong for 3 weeks, the composed, unhurried attention she had catalogued and filed under stranger. And she understood now what it was. Not detachment, but patience. The patience of a man who had been waiting to be seen as a person rather than as a name, and who had found it in a back room that smelled of chalk and sizing and the warm metal of a good pressing iron. She thought of Pearl saying this town is smaller than it looks, and thought that she had been wrong about the size of the thing she was standing in. Diane came to the cutting table. She had the particular posture of a woman who has reassembled herself after a shock and is determined to make the reassembly invisible. And she looked at Robert with a directness she had not employed very often in 14 months. "The web dress," she said. "I should have told Agnes we could make arrangements." "Yes," Robert said. "I'll keep that in mind for January." "All right," Robert said. Diane looked at Caleb for a moment, then at Robert again, and something in her face was not comfortable. Not quite an apology and not quite an acknowledgement, but somewhere in the vicinity of both. the expression of a person who has been shown the difference between the cost of a thing and its worth, and has found the lesson unwelcome but unavoidable. She went back to the display counter and began straightening the hat forms that did not need straightening. Floyd left at 1 o'clock with a handshake for Caleb, and a polite nod for Diane, and a pleasant wave for the room in general, entirely unaware of what the room had been, which was the particular mercy of a man who deals in goods rather than in the transactions between people. Pearl stayed another 20 minutes drinking the tea Robert made at the back room table, and told Caleb 3 things about Harlan's Creek that he appeared to already know, and 2 that he clearly did not. And he listened to all 5 with the same quality of attention, which Pearl evidently approved of, because she patted the armrest of the chair she was sitting in and said, "Come by Birch Street sometime. I have things that belong to people you might be interested to know about." "I'll come by," he said. Pearl stood, tied her shawl, looked at Robert one more time with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has watched something she expected to happen finally happen. "Saturday," she said to Robert, meaning the coffee. "Saturday," Robert agreed. Pearl left. The bell above the door settled. The shop returned to the sound of its own work. Robert looked at the locket in her palm. She had kept it closed since she opened it, and she opened it again now, briefly, just long enough to see the 2 photographs side by side, her mother's composed formality and this other woman's different but related quality of having been known. She closed it again. The clasp caught with the small, firm sound it had always made. She set it in the inside pocket of her work bag, the one she brought from home each morning and carried back each evening, the pocket she used for things she needed to have with her. She felt its weight settle there, gold and familiar, and slightly different from how it had felt in October, carrying more now than it had before, 2 women instead of 1, and still no heavier than a coin. Caleb was putting on his coat. "I'll be here for a while longer," he said, "if there's work." "There's always work," she said. He looked at her once more with that steady, unhurried attention, and then he walked to the door, and the bell rang, and the late afternoon light came through the east windows at a low angle that caught the fabric on the bolt rack and turned it briefly to something warmer than it was. Robert stood at the cutting table with her hands flat on the surface, the way she had been standing when Floyd walked in, and she felt the shop around her as she had not felt it before. Not Diane's shop, not the room she had come to in a difficult hour because she had needed work and had that look they get. Just a room with good light in the mornings and a pressing iron she had carried from home, and 14 months of work folded neatly into the grain of the table under her hands. She picked up the shears. She had a collar to finish before closing.